Whose unseen steps echo through the hollow, and why? Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Share in the mystery. Drop a comment with your location. Your voices make this journey richer. Now, let's begin. A mild September sun filtered through the shifting leaves of the elms that line the main road of St. Anselm's, throwing dappled light over the whitewashed cottages and the neat little gardens that were the pride of their owners. The village was preparing itself for the annual harvest fair, a tradition that drew not only the local residents, but a scattering of curious visitors from the surrounding countryside. Bunting fluttered over the green, the air was laced with the sweet scent of baked apples, and the sound of the church bells carried cheerfully on the breeze. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably ensconced on the vicarage lawn with her knitting bag at her side, had been persuaded to attend by the vicar's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, who insisted that fresh air and good company would do her a world of good after a quiet summer. She sat in the shade, her keen blue eyes following the scene with apparent idleness, though in truth, she was noting a dozen small interactions that most people would overlook. Mrs. Platt's curt avoidance of young Mr. Carroway, the faint but significant pause when Dr. Latimer greeted Mrs. Howard, the curious way a certain stranger's eyes swept the village green before fixing on the lane toward Chimney Hollow. Chimney Hollow itself was an old, crumbling estate on the edge of the village, abandoned for the better part of 20 years. Its great chimneys, visible from half the parish, stood like watchful sentinels over the encroaching ivy. Children told ghost stories about it. Adults shook their heads and said it was a pity the place had gone to ruin. The new owner, an elusive gentleman named Mr. Gerald Redmayne, had arrived in June but rarely ventured out. Rumor had it that he was delicate, morose, or perhaps a bit peculiar, depending on the source. Miss Marple was halfway through her tea when a sudden disturbance rippled through the green. It began as a startled cry from young Alice Pettiford, the miller's daughter, who came running from the hollow lane path, her face pale, eyes wide. Several villagers hurried toward her, Mrs. Weatherby among them, fussing and flapping like a mother hen. Alice clutched her hands together. I didn't mean to trespass," she stammered, "but I was picking blackberries by the hollow, and I heard them. Footsteps in the gravel path by the side door. But when I looked, there wasn't anyone there." Her words might have been dismissed as childish fancy, but there was something in the way she glanced over her shoulder, toward the lane and the looming chimneys, that silenced the little crowd. A moment later, Mr. Carroway emerged from the same lane, his expression oddly set, a smudge of dust on the cuff of his jacket. He avoided meeting anyone's gaze, muttered something about just stretching my legs, and headed straight across the green without pausing for so much as a greeting. By the time the sun had begun its slow descent, the mood of the harvest fair had changed. Conversation turned in low, speculative tones toward Chimney Hollow. Someone recalled seeing a dim light in the upper windows the previous night. Someone else mentioned a cart rumbling along the road well past midnight. Miss Marple, folding her knitting with care, remarked softly to Mrs. Weatherby, "It is the little things that tell the larger story, my dear. Footsteps where there should be none. Dust on a man's sleeve, and a girl too frightened to invent such a tale. I dare say we shall hear more of this before long." What no one yet knew was that before the week was out, a far more dreadful discovery would be made at Chimney Hollow. One that would make those phantom footsteps seem almost a trivial matter. The rest of the afternoon had a queer, taut quality, as though the village green itself were holding its breath. People went on with their errands, pies were judged, and church banners folded. Yet each conversation curled back to Chimney Hollow. Mrs. Platt told anyone who would listen that she, for one, had always said the place would bring trouble. and Mr. Green at the grocer's found reason to remark, rather often, that young people had too much imagination these days. Miss Marple, who did not hold with sweeping statements about youth, thanked him for the jam he pressed upon her and took the shaded lane home by the vicarage, pausing at a stile that gave a slantwise view over the fields to the hollow's clustered chimneys. There is a difference, she reflected, between footsteps that mean to arrive and footsteps that mean to be heard. The child's fright, Mr. Carroway's dusty sleeve, the stranger's careful survey of the lane. These were not isolated notes, but bars in a simple tune. The question was, who had written it and why? A rook settled on a cracked chimney pot, cawing softly. Behind the chimneys, the sky bruised toward evening. Mrs. Weatherby called upon her before supper, distracted, for she had seen Alice Pettiford home and found the girl trembling at each creak of the cottage rafters. "Do, please come with me in the morning," she pleaded. "Her mother is certain she is overset and will be better with a familiar face. She likes you, Jane." "Children are sensible when they've something real to be afraid of," Miss Marple said mildly. "We shall go." They did, at 10 o'clock, when the village's customary bustle returned to its weekday pattern. The Pettiford's cottage, with geraniums blazing in 2 red pots on the sill, had a tidy look that bespoke a mother's pride. Within, the scent of starch and sunlight reigned. Alice, a pale, neatly plaited creature, sat with a cup of milk in both hands, as though she might spill it if she did not hold it very tightly. "I didn't go in," she began, as though anticipating rebuke. "I wouldn't. I went no farther than the bramble hedge by the side door. There's a bit of gravel there, miss, where the weeds haven't taken. And I heard it crunching, slow-like. Not like someone running, but like someone not wanting to be heard. Only you can't help crunching, can you? I thought it was a cat at first, for I heard a sort of soft scritch as well, like something sliding." "What did you do when you heard that?" Miss Marple asked, as Mrs. Weatherby patted the girl's shoulder. "I ducked," Alice said simply, with a little hiccuping laugh at her own instinct. "I hid behind the elder stump. I thought, perhaps the door will open." It didn't. There was the crunch, then nothing. "Then," she added with a frown of concentration, "a smell. My auntie uses lavender water, proper stuff, not the cheap. And it was like that, only sharper. I don't know how something can smell sharp, but it did. I looked, and the door was just not fast, like the latch hadn't taken." "Did you see anyone?" "No, miss. Only the shadow of the drain pipe moving on the door where the sun went in and out. I dropped my basket and the berries went everywhere and I ran." "What you did was very sensible," Miss Marple said, and meant it. "Thank you, my dear. Tell me, do you recall the sound of the steps? Was there any pattern? A limp, perhaps?" Alice screwed up her eyes. "I watched my stepfather when he had his corn last year. He made a sort of pause on his right foot. This was more like—" She tapped her own heel with her finger. "Like the heel didn't catch the ground proper. It sounded funny." Mrs. Weatherby looked at Miss Marple rather helplessly. Miss Marple's needles clicked once against each other in her bag, a thoughtful little tap. A worn heel or a wedge cut? Men who trimmed their own soles did so unevenly. A cobbler's work left cleaner edges. Outside, they met Sergeant Burrows coming up the lane, a square-shouldered man with a complexion that ran to the florid when fussed. He tipped his hat, then tipped it again for Miss Marple. The second tip was unconsciously respectful. "Morning, ma'am. Mrs. Weatherby. We've had a bit of to-do with people gossiping and frightening themselves. Best if I go and look." He cleared his throat. "You've heard the scuttle. Young Alice says she heard steps. She did, Miss Marple said, and she heard them on the side gravel. The latch of the door failed to catch. Perhaps a wedge of wood has swollen. I shall see. He hesitated. If you wouldn't mind keeping folk away from the lane, Mrs. Weatherby. No use having half the parish tramping over what might be, significant. I will post the Mothers' Union at the corner, Mrs. Weatherby said with determination. There are few barriers more absolute than a resolute Mothers' Union. She departed in a flutter of good intentions. Would you like me to come along, Sergeant? Miss Marple asked, as one might ask to accompany an invalid on a short walk. I am very good at noticing whether a latch has been oiled. He suppressed a smile, then thought better of it. Very well, ma'am. If you promise not to set foot inside unless I say. They took the lane, Burrows accompanied by George, the verger, who carried a stout stick as though it imbued him with authority, and Mr. Tooks, the wheelwright, who had turned up with a coil of rope over his shoulder and an expression of grim enjoyment. The hollow loomed ahead, more ruin than house, its tall chimneys wedged against the sky. The side door lay in a lee of brickwork where ivy had been tugged away and left to die in a tangle. The gravel was as Alice had said, a narrow strip, weed-bitten but visible. Burrows crouched, then rose with a grunt. Prints of a sort, he said. The ground's too hard to say much. Heel like a rubber sole and there's a chip out of it. See the little crescent where it didn't take? Miss Marple leaned without bending, in a way that put no pressure on the scene. Indeed, she said, as if admiring a geranium. Beside the print, almost invisible against the grit, lay a teased puff of gray. And a flake of mortar, she observed. Not from underfoot, I fancy. That would be powdery. This is flecked. See how it holds together? It was brushed against something rough. An elbow, say. Burrows looked at her with an expression that was half a sigh. Well, ma'am, we did all see Mr. Carroway with dust on his sleeve yesterday. It is unkind to leap, Miss Marple murmured. But if one must, better to leap at an idea than a person. Mr. Carroway is an orderly young man. He would brush his sleeve before crossing the green, unless the dust came after. It is curious, is it not? Burrows rattled the latch, which gave with the slightest of protests, as though reluctant to admit daylight. The door yielded. An odor breathed out, old wood, damp plaster, and beneath it, faint, that same thin thread of lavender that Alice had called sharp. Inside, the passage was dim, the papers sagging in great bellies from the damp. Burrows lifted a hand. Just here, and no farther, please, ma'am. He stepped over the threshold, George and Tooks behind him, their boots making a respectful hush on the boards. Miss Marple lingered at the sill, her gaze moving with idle patience. A smear of something darker than dust marked the edge of the door at shoulder height, not rust. She rubbed it lightly with a gloved finger and had the impression of grease that had lost its virtue. A door eased with a not quite suitable oil. One used what one had. Camphorated oil had about it a cousinship with lavender in the nose. She tucked that away with the other small things. Nothing in the hall, Burrows called. A stair. Cellar door's been tried. The latches scratched. I don't like that. Mr. Tooks, take your rope and steady now. Miss Marple did not see the cellar, being true to her word, but she heard the men's voices carry up in an echo that made them sound further away. There was a brief clink, like glass on stone, and then a pause while nobody said anything at all. Silence is rarely empty. It fills with what people would rather not name. Bottle? Burrows said at last, too heartily. An old thing. And a broken crate. No one's sleeping down here. The dust's thick and even. Only at the stair, there's a patch where it's been scuffed clean. Someone brushed past with a coat. See? His boots thudded on the treads. He reappeared, blinking in the stronger light, with a small object pinched between forefinger and thumb. What do you make of that, then? It was a scrap of paper, not quite square, neatly torn along one edge where a perforation had guided the hand. The print was blue, not black, and the paper had that fibrous, slightly glossy quality of a cheap program. Miss Marple read the tiny words upside down, without seeming to. Evening performance, Pavilion Theater, seafront. Below it, a date from a fortnight previous, and the name of a play whose title aimed at sophistication and achieved only a certain noisy confusion. Somebody has modern tastes, George said disapprovingly. Not our Mr. Redmayne. He's been ailing, so they say. Mr. Redmayne, said Burroughs, has been invisible. I'll call at his lodgings after we're done here. He looked at Miss Marple. Ma'am? She shook her head. I was only thinking of seaside theaters, she said. They always smell of dust and scent in the sea, a mixture people mistake for glamour. The girls wear too much lavender. It clings to cheap clothes like a secret. Her tone was gentle, musing. And seaside towns draw all sorts in late summer. A person can be very nearly anyone for a week. They did a slow circuit of the lower rooms that Sergeant Burroughs permitted. And if there was a shock to be had that day, it did not spring on them there. There were signs, rather, of someone's attempt at making a deserted place only half deserted. A scoured patch on a kitchen table where a plate had stood, a crust of bread hardened to stone, the ghost of tea in the bottom of a mug. The dust had been disturbed, but not violently. Someone had crept, not hurried. Someone had waited and done so without comfort. On the way back along the lane, they met Dr. Latimer, whose practiced cheer rubbed a half-second late at the corners of his eyes. He greeted Miss Marple and the sergeant with proper civility, then pretended to remember an appointment and turned away by the school stile. Miss Marple's look was with him for a moment, then not. She had a very tidy mind about other people's privacy, except where it might become public business. Mrs. Howard, passing with a basket on her arm, saw the doctor and flickered like a candle in a draught before she steadied and asked whether there was to be a whist drive on Thursday. If you go and win again, I shall be quite put out, she told Miss Marple, too brightly. By afternoon, Sergeant Burroughs had called upon Mr. Redmayne at the Dower cottage, which stood in a sulk behind two yews that had grown together like old gossips. He returned with little for his efforts. Mr. Redmayne's man, Simmons, a gaunt, tight-lipped person, had said his master was not receiving visitors. He was resting. He was indisposed. He was... Simmons had tried on several words, as one tries on shirts, and had kept none. I could insist, Burroughs grumbled. But on what? Footsteps and gossip. I saw a blind move. He is there. That can be, Miss Marple said, and yet not quite there in every way. A person can be very present and very absent, especially if he is afraid. That evening, lights kindled early at the Swan. The stranger who had surveyed the hollow lane sat at a corner table, hat set at the angle of a man who wishes not to be seen and hopes thereby to be remembered. Mrs. Mullins, the landlady, told Mrs. Platt, as the latter lifted her second stout in what she declared a medicinal manner, that the gentleman had given his name as Mr. Faulkner and had paid for 2 nights with a banknote that made her eyes blink. He had asked, casually of course, whether there was any decent walking out towards the old place on the edge of the village. You'd think we were a spa, Mrs. Mullins said later to Mr. Green, for all the interest in our walks. Miss Marple, at home with her kettle singing, wrote 2 short notes. One to the vicar, suggesting he mention, quite as a matter of course from the pulpit, that the hollow was not safe for children to explore. Another to Mrs. Weatherby, asking if she would be so kind as to drop by with the recipe for her apple cake. It was, to anyone watching, the industrious trifling of an old lady. To Miss Marple, it was the setting of small, prompt boundaries. People kept to safety better when they believed it their own idea. At 9:30, a thin rain began, the sort that rustles hedges without wetting the ground. From her window, Miss Marple saw a pocket of light moving where no light should be, the pale bob of a lantern along the strip of gravel by the side door. She did not tell herself she imagined it. Instead, she put on her coat and fetched a shawl, for shawls are a comfort in more ways than warmth, and walked to Mrs. Weatherby's, which lay conveniently halfway to the lane, and enlisted her for a brief airing. "We mustn't go near," she said, "only as far as the stile." They stood at the stile and watched the dark shoulder of the house. The lantern's glow lessened, then swelled, like breath behind cupped hands. Someone was just within the door. After a long minute, the light vanished as if a cap had been clapped over it. A moment later, very quietly, a figure detached itself from the lee of the wall and went not toward the village, but across the meadow, where no path ran, moving with the care of one who knows which tussocks sink and which hold. Even at a distance, Miss Marple thought she recognized the outline of the coat. Too neat for a laborer, too shabby for a gentleman. Mr. Carroway had such a coat. So did 3 other men in St. Anselm's, which was untidy of Providence. "Shall we call the sergeant?" whispered Mrs. Weatherby, who was brave in a way that looked like fear and felt like duty. "Not yet," Miss Marple said. "He will be at the Swan, and by the time we fetched him, the lantern would be promised away as a trick of the light." She laid a hand, small and capable, on Mrs. Weatherby's arm. "Tomorrow will do for the sergeant. Tonight, we have learned that whoever visits the hollow does not care for lanes." They returned, and the rain fretted itself out. At 10:20, Dr. Latimer went by at a clip, his hat pulled low, and a quarter-hour later, Mrs. Howard's upstairs lamp burned and burned, though she lived alone and had always favored early nights. Before sleep, Miss Marple considered the program scrap, the smell of lavender like a penny cent, the wedge-cut heel, the brushed sleeve. She thought of seaside towns and the sort of young men who go there to not quite be themselves, and the sort of women who help them. She thought of Mr. Redmayne's moving blind, and of Simmons' carefully chosen words. She thought of Mr. Carroway crossing the green with dust on his cuff, as if the dust had an errand and had not yet delivered it. Human beings, she knew, did not change their natures without cause. When they behaved as though they had, the cause was nearly always nearby and often embarrassingly ordinary. Money, fear, pride, love, and their shadowy cousins. At dawn, before the baker set out his trays, a farm boy driving his milk cart cut along the meadow and jolted to a halt at the far wall of the hollow's kitchen garden. He had come the shortcut to save his pony a hill. There, caught in the prickle of a dead gooseberry bush as neatly as if it had been hung there, was a glove. He would not have noticed it, but for the way the light took the stitching. It was a man's glove, left hand of cheap brown leather, the sort kept in a drawer for Sundays, and it smelled, faintly and uncomfortably, of a scent he couldn't name, but would have called sharp if anyone had asked him. By 9 o'clock, the glove lay on Sergeant Burroughs's desk, with a glass tumbler over it, as if it might escape. By 10, the stranger at the Swan had not come down to breakfast. At 1:15, Mrs. Mullins rapped and rapped on his door, brisk and respectful, and got no answer. When the sergeant came with his key and turned the lock, they found the bed as neat as if Mr. Faulkner had never laid in it, and a neatly folded theater program upon the table, its perforated corner missing, set above a single line in a precise, foreign-looking hand. Kindly forward any letters to the Pavilion Post Restante. Sergeant Burroughs swore under his breath, which was not his habit. Miss Marple, who had come because Mrs. Mullins ran first to the vicarage and then to the nearest sense, read the line and did not smile. "It is curious," she said, "how people who wish to be lost leave such tidy directions for being found." Just then, from the direction of Chimney Hollow, a sound came that stilled the conversation in the Swan, turned the boy at the bar to stone with a tankard halfway to a shelf, and brought Sergeant Burroughs upright, hand to his hat without knowing it. It was the sort of sound that is not a scream and yet carries the same pitch, a long, tearing breath that began in the throat and ended with the blunt break of impact. It was the sound a door makes when it strikes hard against a stop. And what followed after was the quieter sound, worse somehow, of something heavy sliding a little and then stopping, very gently, because there was nowhere farther to go. For a moment, no one in the Swan moved, as though the sound had frozen them where they stood. Then Sergeant Burroughs was at the door in 3 strides, shouting for George the Verger to come along, and half the men inside followed without needing to be told. Miss Marple, moving far more slowly, set down her teacup, slipped the strap of her knitting bag over her arm, and came after them at her own unhurried pace. The lane to Chimney Hollow was narrow, its hedges bowed in from years of wind, and the morning's drizzle had left the earth slick. The air was still with that peculiar thickness that sometimes precedes a storm, though the sky was a washed-out blue. Ahead, the old house stood as it had always stood, the chimneys stabbing upward, ivy clawing at the walls. Yet there was a subtle difference to its presence, a kind of attention, as though it were listening. Burroughs reached the side door first. It was ajar, swinging very slightly in a way no latch should permit. He pushed it open with one palm, his other hand raised in an instinctive caution. The smell inside hit at once. Old damp and plaster dust, with something sour underneath, and yes, that same faint, sharp thread of lavender Alice had described. In the hall, near the foot of the stairs, lay a man. He was on his side, one arm flung awkwardly forward, the other bent beneath him. His hat had rolled into the corner, and the unnatural angle of his head told the truth before Burroughs crouched and pressed fingers to his throat. He shook his head once, sharply. "Who is it?" George asked, peering over the sergeant's shoulder. Burroughs rolled the man enough to see his face. It was Mr. Faulkner, the stranger from the Swan. His eyes were half open, the pupils dull, and there was a bruise blossoming darkly at the temple. His coat was dusted with gray grit, as if he had struck the wall in falling. "Looks like he tumbled down," Tukes said from the doorway, the coil of rope still over his shoulder. "These stairs are treacherous." Miss Marple had come to stand just within the threshold, her expression one of gentle concern rather than shock. She glanced upward. The stair rose steeply to a narrow landing, its banister missing 2 spindles. The newel post at the bottom bore a smear of something pale. She moved a fraction closer, leaning as though merely seeking a better look at the wallpaper. "If he fell," she said softly, "he would have come forward, not sideways into the wall." Burroughs straightened. "You think?" "I think the stair is narrow, the wall close, and the bruise is at the wrong height for a simple slip. But of course, accidents can be remarkably inconsistent. Has anyone touched him?" "No," Burroughs said. We'll leave him be till the doctor gets here. George, run to fetch Latimer and tell him to come quick." George went. The rest of them stood in that uneasy silence that descends when death is present but not yet spoken of in formal terms. Miss Marple's eyes traveled to the man's left hand. It was gloveless. The skin along the wrist was marked faintly by a line of dust, as if a glove had been worn and then pulled off in haste. "Sergeant," she said, "there was a glove found in the kitchen garden this morning, was there not?" "There was," he said slowly. "Brown leather, left hand." "And here," Miss Marple murmured, "is a man without his left glove." Burroughs looked down at Faulkner's boots. The left heel bore the same crescent chip they had seen in the gravel the day before. "Well," he said, "that answers one question. He was our man in the lane." Dr. Latimer arrived, brisk and businesslike, his medical bag swinging from one hand. He knelt, felt for a pulse he must have known he would not find, and then inspected the bruise with professional detachment. "Force applied from behind and above," he said. "Could have been a push, could have been," he stumbled and struck the wall. "But see here." He touched a second, fainter mark just below the first. "Two impacts, unlikely from a single fall." Burroughs's jaw tightened. "So someone was here with him." "Likely," Latimer said. "Time of death within the hour." He glanced at Miss Marple, then away, as though uncomfortable under her mild scrutiny. "Was anyone seen coming this way?" Burroughs asked. "Not by me," Tukes said. "But then, the meadow's a quicker route if you don't want to be noticed." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the open door, then to the line of hedgerow beyond. "The person who came that way last night knew which ground would hold. They could do so again in daylight if they kept low." Burroughs rose. "Right. George." "Oh, he's gone for the doctor." "Tukes, stay here till I get back. No one in or out." "Miss Marple, I'd rather you not wander, if you please." "Of course, Sergeant," she said, her tone perfectly agreeable. He left to begin the business of questions, starting no doubt with Mrs. Mullins at the Swan and working outward. Miss Marple remained where she was, gazing idly about the hall. The scuffed patch on the stair rail was still there, and just above it she noticed something she had not before. A faint line, as though a narrow object, perhaps a cane or umbrella, had been dragged along. Latimer was packing his instruments. "Unpleasant business," he said, almost to himself. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Have you known Mr. Faulkner long?" Latimer hesitated. "We spoke once, when he asked for directions to the apothecary. I gathered he was not local." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "he seemed to know exactly where to find Chimney Hollow." Latimer glanced at her, his brow tightening. "Perhaps someone told him." He picked up his bag. "If you'll excuse me, I must send for the coroner." When they had gone, Miss Marple stepped closer to the bottom of the stairs. The smear on the newel post was chalky to the touch. Mortar dust, not unlike the flakes she had seen in the gravel. She considered it for a moment, then withdrew her handkerchief and dabbed her fingers clean. Outside, the lane was already gathering the curious. Mrs. Platt stood with Mrs. Howard, their voices low but urgent, while young Alice Pettiford clung to her mother's skirt. Mr. Carroway was there too, shifting from foot to foot, his coat today notably free of dust. He avoided Miss Marple's eye, speaking instead to Mr. Green in a tone that carried too easily. "Terrible accident," he said. "Dangerous place, that hollow. Should be boarded up proper." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly at him. "I imagine the sergeant will be speaking to you later, Mr. Carroway. You were near the lane yesterday, were you not?" His face tightened just slightly. I was taking a walk." "Of course," Miss Marple said, and passed on without further comment. By midday, word had traveled the length of St. Anselm's and beyond. Some said the stranger had been murdered, others insisted it was no more than a tragic misstep. But in the back parlor of the Swan, Sergeant Burroughs was piecing together a different picture. Faulkner had checked in 2 nights before, asked about walks, and made several discreet inquiries about Mr. Redmayne. He had left the inn after supper the previous evening and not returned until late, bringing with him a trace of damp on his coat, though the night had been dry. Miss Marple listened from a chair in the corner, her knitting in her lap. "It would be interesting," she said mildly, "to know whether Mr. Faulkner and Mr. Redmayne had met before his arrival here." Burroughs grunted. "Redmayne says he's never heard of him." "People often say that," Miss Marple observed. "Sometimes it is even true." The sergeant gave her a look that was half exasperation, half curiosity. "Do you know something? You're not telling me?" "Oh, I hardly ever know things," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "I simply notice when other people know them and pretend not to." Outside, the rain returned, this time in earnest, streaking the windows and turning the lane to slick mud. Through it all, the chimneys of the hollow stood against the gray, their outlines blurred, but their presence unshaken. And in the kitchen garden, the gooseberry bush that had caught the glove shivered under the wind, as if it knew more than it could say. That afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby called at Miss Marple's cottage, her cheeks flushed with news. "Jane, you'll never guess. Simmons has been seen in the high street buying a ticket for the late train to the coast. Says it's for an errand, but he had a bag with him. And more, Mrs. Howard's been crying again, and when I asked if she was all right, she said she'd had dreadful news from a friend in Hastings. Only she hasn't a friend in Hastings that I've ever heard of." Miss Marple poured tea. "The seaside again," she murmured. "It does keep coming up, does it not?" Almost as though the answer were determined to point us that way. Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward. "Do you think the man in the hollow was killed over something to do with the coast?" Miss Marple sipped her tea before answering. "I think," she said, "that some people go to the coast to meet others, and some to lose themselves. And sometimes the two purposes cross in ways neither intended." As the rain deepened into evening, Sergeant Burroughs sent word that Mr. Redmayne would, after all, consent to see him the following morning. Miss Marple, hearing this, set aside her knitting and began making a list, not of names, but of times and places: the hollow, the Swan, the meadow path, the train station, the Pavilion Theater. She placed them in her mind like pieces on a board, not yet touching, but waiting. And as she did, she found herself wondering not who had struck Mr. Faulkner, but which of the living had been meant to meet him that morning, and what they would do now that the meeting could never take place. The next morning broke with a pale, uncertain light that did little to lift the damp heaviness left by the night's rain. The air was cool and clean, the hedgerows beaded with moisture, and the road into St. Anselm's bore the marks of cartwheels and boots in the softened earth. Miss Marple, wrapped in her blue shawl, was already at her window when she saw Sergeant Burroughs stride past, his pace brisk and his shoulders squared in the manner of a man determined to get to the bottom of something. She suspected his destination was the Dower cottage, and she had no intention of missing what might transpire. A short while later, she arrived under the pretext of calling upon Mrs. Weatherby, whose house stood conveniently close. The vicar's wife was only too happy to come with her, professing that it was her duty to keep a finger on the pulse of village matters, especially where the welfare of neighbors was concerned. Together, they found themselves near enough to the yews that shielded the dour cottage to overhear the beginning of the exchange. Simmons, the gaunt manservant, opened the door, his expression as pinched as ever. Burroughs's voice was firm but polite. "I've come to speak with Mr. Redmayne. This is no longer a request. It's an official matter." There was the faintest hesitation, a flicker in Simmons's eyes, before he stepped aside. "Very well. You may wait in the parlor." From their vantage by the lane, Miss Marple could just make out Burroughs entering the dim interior. She did not attempt to draw closer. One did not learn more by pressing one's face against windows. People simply became more careful about what they said. Instead, she let her attention roam over the cottage garden. Despite Simmons' tight manner, there were signs of care here. The clipped box hedges, the absence of weeds, the few late roses coaxed into bloom against the stone wall. She noted also a pair of boots by the side path. Men's boots, of good leather, with a faint white crust along the welt where salt water had dried. Within, the conversation grew audible in fragments. "Did not know the man. Why should I?" Mr. Redmayne's voice was dry, cultured, with a note of irritation. "He had a theater program from the pavilion," Burroughs replied. "And you were at the coast a fortnight ago, were you not?" "I took the sea air for my health. Must I account for every casual acquaintance I may or may not have made?" "You must account for your whereabouts yesterday morning," Burroughs said, his patience thinning. There was a pause, and when Redmayne spoke again, his voice had altered, smoothed, as though he had made a conscious effort. "I was here, resting. Simmons can confirm." Simmons' tone was as flat as his manner. Mr. Redmayne remained indoors. "Then perhaps," Burroughs said, "you can explain why a man who was seen asking questions about you ended up dead in a house you own." Miss Marple heard the slight scrape of a chair being pushed back. Redmayne's reply came, low and sharp. "I own the property, yes, but I have not set foot there since purchasing it. It is a ruin, uninhabitable. Anyone may have entered." "Someone certainly did," Burroughs said grimly. "And someone saw to it. Mr. Faulkner never left alive." Miss Marple caught Mrs. Weatherby's sleeve and nodded toward the lane. It was time to move before their presence became too obvious. They retraced their steps, and once out of earshot, Mrs. Weatherby released the breath she had been holding. "Jane, what do you make of it?" Miss Marple gave a small shrug. "There is a curious thing about lies, my dear. They are often woven from threads of truth. I think Mr. Redmayne did not kill Mr. Faulkner, but I think he knows very well why someone might have wished to." By midday, the village was awash in new theories. Mrs. Platt's version had Redmayne in league with smugglers. Mr. Green favored the idea of a quarrel over gambling debts. Mrs. Howard said little, but her eyes had a strained, watchful look. She was seen speaking briefly with Dr. Latimer outside the post office, their words urgent, their faces turned away from the street. That afternoon, Burroughs called on Miss Marple. He was not above acknowledging her knack for seeing connections others missed, though he did so obliquely. "You were near the Hollow the other night," he began, "and you've a way of noticing things. Did you see anyone about besides that lantern?" "Only the figure crossing the meadow," Miss Marple said. "It could have been Mr. Carroway or any man of his height and build." "Carroway says he was at home," Burroughs said. "His sister claims to have seen him in the kitchen at the time, but she seemed nervous." "People often are when they are telling the truth," Miss Marple replied. It's only the very practiced who can lie without it showing. She paused, then added, I think the more interesting question is who Mr. Faulkner meant to meet in the hollow that morning. Burroughs frowned. And you think Redmayne knows? I think he suspects, Miss Marple said, and that is almost as useful. Later that day, she walked to the Pettifords' cottage under the pretext of returning a borrowed cookbook. Alice was out, but Mrs. Pettiford was in and eager to talk. It's dreadful, Miss Marple, dreadful. That poor man. And the hollow, why, my Alice won't even pass the end of the lane now. Did you hear? Mr. Carroway came asking about who was seen there last week. Said it was for his own peace of mind, but I don't see what business it is of his. Miss Marple listened, nodded, and took her leave. On the way home, she detoured toward the meadow, her eyes scanning the ground. The rain had blurred much of what might have been seen, but here and there were traces. A heel mark with a telltale crescent chip, another print less distinct but narrower, perhaps a woman's shoe. These led toward a gap in the hedge that opened not onto the lane, but into a field path running toward the far edge of the village. She stood for a moment, picturing the route. A person could come from the hollow, cross the meadow, and take this path to reach the high street without passing the green at all. And from there, the train station was only a short walk. The next morning brought another piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Mullins, her face flushed from the walk, came to Miss Marple's door. Jane, you'll want to know. Sergeant Burroughs has just been told by the station master that a ticket to Hastings was purchased the morning of the murder, paid for in cash. The buyer was wearing gloves, and the station lad thought he caught a whiff of lavender scent when he handed over the change. Miss Marple's eyes brightened ever so slightly. And did the lad see their face? He says he's not certain, Mrs. Mullins said. Could have been a woman in a hat pulled low or a man with a scarf. He wouldn't swear either way. When she was alone again, Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched in her lap. The picture was sharpening. Someone had reason to meet Faulkner in the hollow. Someone had reason to ensure he never spoke again. And that reason was tangled with the coast, the Pavilion Theater, and the scent of cheap lavender. She thought again of the torn program. That scrap had been in Faulkner's possession, but perhaps it had once belonged to someone else. Programs were not rare, but their perforated edges could match like puzzle pieces if kept. By mid-afternoon, she had decided on a small experiment. She wrote 2 brief notes, one to Mrs. Howard, inviting her to tea the following day, and one to Dr. Latimer, requesting a word about a small medical matter. She asked the vicar's boy to deliver them, knowing the village would take note of her invitations, and more importantly, that the recipients would take note of each other. As evening fell, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the hollow. The house was as silent as ever, but in the damp earth near the side door, she saw fresh marks. Not the crescent heel this time, but a smooth sole, the kind found on women's walking shoes. The prints led up to the door and back again, as though the visitor had approached, hesitated, and then withdrawn. She bent to look more closely and caught a faint glimmer among the gravel. It was a small button, mother of pearl, with a hairline crack, the sort used on ladies' gloves. She tucked it carefully into her handkerchief and continued on her way, the chimneys of the hollow watching her until she was out of sight. In the quiet of her cottage, she set the button beside her teacup and considered the list she had made. It was time, she thought, to stop waiting for the pieces to come to her. The next move must be hers, and it must be one that drew the real killer into the open. The following day, dawned with a brittle clarity, the kind of morning that seems to sharpen the outlines of every rooftop and hedge. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke from the first fires of the season. Miss Marple, who had been up since 6:30, had her table set for tea well before her guests were due. A small plate of seed cake sat in the center, flanked by cups and saucers of a pattern so old they were back in fashion again, and by the hearth her knitting bag lay open, its contents ready to provide the appearance of casual domesticity. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mrs. Howard arrived, her manner composed, but her eyes shadowed as if sleep had been an infrequent visitor. She wore a dove-gray suit that suited her coloring and gloves of pale kid leather, not new, but well kept. Miss Marple received her with a warmth that was both genuine and calculated. 10 minutes later, Dr. Latimer was shown in by the vicar's boy, who accepted a slice of cake and a copper coin in exchange for his discretion. "I thought it might be pleasant to have a little company," Miss Marple said, settling them by the fire. "It's such a comfort, I find, to hear the news from friends rather than from the rumor mill." The opening exchanges were politely vague, remarks on the weather, the slow progress of autumn, the harvest fair still being spoken of in fragments. Then Miss Marple, as if struck by a sudden thought, turned to Mrs. Howard. "My dear, didn't I see you once in Hastings? On the promenade, I believe, some years back." Mrs. Howard hesitated just enough for the pause to register before she smiled faintly. "Possibly. I've been there a few times. For the sea air." "It does one good," Miss Marple agreed. "And such a lively theater. I remember seeing a performance at the Pavilion. What was it called? Ah, yes, The Scarlet Dancer. A dreadful play, really, but the lavender scent in the lobby was quite overpowering. One could hardly forget it." Dr. Latimer's hand, lifting his cup, stilled for a fraction before continuing. Mrs. Howard's eyes flickered toward him and away. Miss Marple saw both movements and filed them alongside the button in her handkerchief drawer. "I imagine," Miss Marple went on, "that many of the same people go back year after year. Rather like a village in that way. One gets to know the faces. It must be awkward, though, to run into someone unexpectedly, especially if one would rather not." Mrs. Howard's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. "Is this about that poor man at the Hollow?" she asked, her voice carefully even. Miss Marple's expression was all gentle confusion. "Oh, my dear, I hadn't said so. But since you mention it, yes, I imagine it would be awkward indeed if someone from a seaside acquaintance turned up in one's quiet village asking questions." Dr. Latimer set his cup down with more force than necessary. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting—" "I never suggest," Miss Marple interrupted mildly. "I merely observe. For example, I have observed that the glove found at the Hollow was of the same make as the ones you are wearing now, Mrs. Howard, and that a certain mother-of-pearl button from such a glove was lying in the gravel by the side door only yesterday evening." Mrs. Howard's color rose and then drained. "If you mean to accuse me—" "I mean to do nothing of the sort," Miss Marple said. "But perhaps you might explain why you were at the Hollow at all." Mrs. Howard's lips parted, but before she could answer, Dr. Latimer spoke. "This is nonsense. Mrs. Howard had no reason—" "On the contrary," Miss Marple said quietly, "she had every reason. Mr. Faulkner was not unknown to her. He was at the Pavilion Theater a fortnight ago, the same night she was there. He had with him a program from that evening, torn as though part of it had been given to someone else. When he came to St. Anselm's, he still had the matching half in his pocket." The silence that followed was thick. Mrs. Howard's hands were clenched together in her lap. At last she said, "He wasn't supposed to come here. He promised he wouldn't. But he knew something. Something that could hurt a person I care for." "And that person," Miss Marple said softly, "is Dr. Latimer." Latimer's face flushed. "This is absurd." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "Mr. Faulkner, I believe, had been a patient of yours under another name. He saw something, or learned something, he thought could be turned to profit. Perhaps it was a youthful indiscretion, perhaps something in your past work. In any case, he came here to press his advantage." Mrs. Howard's voice broke. "He meant to ruin him. He said if I didn't persuade Latimer to pay, he'd go to the papers. I told him to leave. I thought, if I frightened him—" Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but her words were precise. "You met him at the Hollow that morning, intending to warn him away. But words led to tempers. Perhaps you pushed him without meaning to. Or perhaps someone else arrived at just the wrong moment." Mrs. Howard shook her head, tears spilling now. "I left him there, alive. I swear it. He was angry, but alive." Miss Marple believed her. There was sincerity in the woman's distress, and a certain helplessness that could not easily be feigned. But it left a pressing question. If Mrs. Howard had left Faulkner alive, who had delivered the fatal blow in the next hour? Dr. Latimer rose abruptly. "I think this conversation has gone far enough." "I agree," Miss Marple said, surprising them both. "The rest, I think, should be told to Sergeant Burroughs. He is the one who can determine whether the law sees this as a quarrel or as murder." She let them go, knowing they would speak together at once, and perhaps reveal more in their urgency than they intended. Alone again, she sat in her chair and thought. Mrs. Howard's account fitted much of what she suspected, but not all. There was still the matter of the lantern the night before the murder, the train ticket to Hastings, and Mr. Redmayne's watchful seclusion. By early evening, the village was stirring with fresh rumor. Someone claimed to have seen Simmons at the railway station again, this time without any luggage. Others said Mr. Carroway had been overheard in the Swan, asking whether Faulkner had left anything behind in his room. The puzzle pieces were shifting again, and Miss Marple knew the time was coming when she would need to place them before the right eyes. That night, she took one last walk toward the Hollow. The air was cool, the moon veiled behind drifting cloud. As she reached the stile that overlooked the meadow, she paused. Across the grass, near the shadowed flank of the house, a figure stood, very still, watching. The height and stance suggested a man, but the features were lost in shadow. After a moment, he turned and slipped into the darkness, not toward the lane, but toward the hedge gap that led to the village's far edge. Miss Marple stayed at the stile until the night swallowed all movement. Then she turned for home, her mind already arranging what she would say to Sergeant Burroughs in the morning. For if she was right, the person she had just seen was not merely a curious trespasser, but the one who had been waiting in the Hollow for Mr. Faulkner, and whose patience had ended in murder. And if she moved carefully, she might yet coax that person into stepping, unknowing, into the light. The following morning brought a pale, unsettled sky, streaked with thin clouds that promised a change in the weather. Miss Marple was up early, her breakfast tray neatly cleared away, and by 8:30, she was walking toward the high street with the deliberate air of someone who had errands to run. Though, in truth, her principal errand was with Sergeant Burroughs. She found him in his small office at the back of the police station, a place that always smelled faintly of ink and coal dust. He was bent over a stack of papers, his pen scratching with the grim determination of a man who would rather be doing anything else. "Morning, ma'am," he said, looking up. "I was going to send for you." "That's fortunate," Miss Marple replied, taking the chair opposite his desk without waiting to be offered it. "I thought it was time we compared notes." Burroughs leaned back, folding his arms. "I've spoken again to Mrs. Howard. She admits she met Faulkner at the Hollow the morning he died. Says she left him alive. Her story's possible, but it doesn't explain who finished him." "I believe her," Miss Marple said. "She's guilty of concealment, but not of killing. The more interesting question is who knew she was meeting Faulkner, and who took advantage of that knowledge." Burroughs tapped the desk with one blunt finger. "You think someone followed her?" "Or arrived just after she left," Miss Marple said. "Someone who already had reason to silence him. You've had no more luck with Mr. Redmayne, I suppose?" Burroughs's expression soured. "He's polite enough, but tight as a clam. Simmons hovers over him like a watchdog. Says his health's too delicate for prolonged questioning. And yet, I can't shake the feeling he's in the middle of this somehow." "Not in the middle," Miss Marple corrected gently. "On the edge, where one sees everything without being seen oneself. A useful position if one wishes to know other people's business." Burroughs gave her a sideways glance. "You've got someone in mind, haven't you?" "I have two," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Carraway and Simmons. Both have been near the Hollow when they had no stated reason to be. Both could cross the meadow without being observed. And both, I suspect, knew Mr. Faulkner's arrival in St. Anselm's was not accidental." The sergeant grunted. "Carraway claims he was at home at the time. His sister backs him." "Sisters can be very loyal," Miss Marple said mildly, "particularly if they believe they're protecting a brother from a harmless mistake." Burroughs rubbed his jaw. "And Simmons?" "I can't see him taking a life for no reason." "Perhaps he had a reason," Miss Marple said. "If Faulkner knew something that could damage Mr. Redmayne, Simmons would feel it his duty to prevent it coming to light. Whether that duty was misplaced is another matter." Burroughs sighed. "I need something more solid than perhaps." "Then," Miss Marple said, "let us create something more solid. We must invite our culprit to incriminate himself, or herself, by acting when they believe the danger has returned." Burroughs frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Miss Marple said, "that we give the impression Mr. Faulkner left something important behind, something that could expose his dealings at the coast. If the right person hears of it, they may try to recover it before it can be handed to you. And if they do, we shall be waiting." Burroughs stared at her for a long moment, and then a slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're a dangerous woman, Miss Marple." "Oh, no," she said with a modest dip of her head. "Only observant." By noon, the plan was in motion. Burroughs let it be known, in casual conversation at the Swan, that Faulkner's belongings had been inventoried and a small locked tin found among them. "Could be nothing," he said loudly enough for half the village to hear. "But there's a paper inside, writing on it. We'll see soon enough." He mentioned, as if in passing, that the tin was being kept temporarily in the old cupboard at the police station, since the safe was occupied with other evidence. Miss Marple observed the ripple of interest this created. Mr. Carraway was in the corner, pretending to read the paper, but turning a shade paler. Simmons passed through on some errand, his eyes briefly narrowing at the mention. Even Mrs. Platt leaned forward in her chair to catch the details. That evening, Burroughs arranged for the cupboard to be left apparently unattended, its key in the top drawer of his desk. The tin was in fact an old tobacco box with a folded scrap of newspaper inside. Miss Marple, seated at her own window with a good view of the station door, waited. The hours crept by. At 10 o'clock, the street was quiet, a faint mist curling along the cobbles. A shadow detached itself from the darker mass of the Swan's wall and moved with slow purpose toward the station. The figure was tall and moved with care, pausing once to glance behind. Miss Marple thought she recognized the coat, neat, serviceable, with a faint shine at the elbows. Caraway's. But before the figure reached the station door, another emerged from the lane beside the vicarage. Shorter, stockier, with the quick, deliberate gait of someone used to being invisible. Simmons. The two men saw each other, froze, and then Caraway made an abrupt retreat, vanishing into the mist. Simmons hesitated only a moment before continuing to the door. He tried it, found it locked, and withdrew, his expression unreadable in the fog. Miss Marple sat back, her mind ticking over. Two interested parties, neither willing to risk being caught in the act. The question now was which had been first in the hollow with Faulkner and which had come after. The next morning, Burroughs called on her, his face grim. Our bait worked, sort of. Caraway came to see me first thing. Said he'd overheard the talk about the tin and thought it might have belonged to his late father. Utter rot. But it's his cover. And Simmons has taken leave from Redmayne's service. Says he's gone to see a relative in Dover. He left an hour after that business at the station. Miss Marple nodded. Then we must move quickly. I believe the answer lies not here, but at the coast, in Hastings. Hastings? Yes, Miss Marple said. That is where Faulkner and Mrs. Howard met a fortnight ago. That is where the Pavilion Theater stands. And that is where, I think, Faulkner acquired the leverage he hoped to use. If we go there, we may discover what and who it concerned. By late afternoon, they were on the train, Burroughs in plain clothes and Miss Marple a picture of unassuming gentility. The journey was uneventful, the countryside sliding past in a blur of gold and green. At Hastings, the sea air hit them immediately, salt and faintly metallic, with the cries of gulls overhead. The Pavilion Theater, when they reached it, was shuttered for the day. But the manager, a florid man with the manner of one who enjoys his own voice, was willing to talk. "Oh yes, I remember Faulkner," he said. "Came to see the Scarlet Dancer. Sat in the back, kept to himself. Not a regular, but he spoke to one of our chorus girls in the interval. Pretty little thing, Annie Fletcher. She's off just now, staying with her aunt in Bexhill." "Did he speak to anyone else?" Miss Marple asked. The manager frowned. "Now, you mention it, yes. There was a gent in the stalls, well-dressed, looked out of place in our little theater. Could have been a doctor or solicitor. They had a quiet word in the lobby after the show. I thought nothing of it." Miss Marple's eyes met Burroughs's. "A doctor," she said softly. It was almost dark when they returned to St. Anselm's. Miss Marple knew the next step would be delicate. If Dr. Latimer had met Faulkner at the Pavilion, it explained much. Mrs. Howard's fear, Faulkner's presence in the village, and perhaps the fatal urgency in the hollow. But there was still the matter of who had dealt the final blow. And until that was clear, she would keep her conclusions to herself, while setting the stage for the final act, in which the truth, however reluctant, would have to walk into the light. That evening, St. Anselm's lay under a hushed, watchful stillness, the kind that seemed to fall over the village whenever gossip had gone as far as it could without fresh fuel. Lamps glowed faintly behind curtained windows, and the faint scent of rain on warm earth lingered in the air. Miss Marple, back in her cottage after the journey to Hastings, allowed herself a quiet supper before settling into her chair by the hearth. Her mind was not on her knitting, though her needles clicked with the same steady rhythm. She was arranging, in her thoughts, the small fragments of truth she had gathered into something resembling a pattern. The fragments were these. Faulkner had been in Hastings a fortnight before his death, at the Pavilion Theater. He had met Mrs. Howard there, but more importantly, he had spoken to Dr. Latimer. The theater's manager had confirmed that meeting, though without recognizing its significance. Mrs. Howard had admitted she saw Faulkner in the Hollow on the morning of the murder and had left him alive. Dr. Latimer had denied knowing Faulkner beyond a passing introduction. Yet Faulkner had traveled from the coast to this small village with questions clearly directed toward Mr. Redmayne and, by extension, toward someone in Redmayne's circle. Miss Marple's intuition told her that the connection between Hastings and St. Anselm's was not one of idle coincidence. People did not come to out-of-the-way places without a reason, especially not men like Faulkner, who carried scraps of theater programs as though they were proof of something. It was 8:30 when Sergeant Burroughs called. His manner was restless, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "I've had word from Dover," he said without preamble. Simmons never went to any relative. Took the night train to Brighton instead. Disappeared after that. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "He's running," she said. "Or perhaps going to ground until he knows whether the danger has passed." Burroughs nodded. "I've also been thinking about what that theater manager told us. A doctor in the stalls, well-dressed, quiet talk in the lobby afterwards. If that was Latimer, he's lying about never knowing Faulkner. But why?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is the question on which all else depends. If we knew why, we might know who pushed Faulkner into the wall at the foot of those stairs." Burroughs's jaw tightened. "You've got a plan forming, haven't you?" "A small one," Miss Marple admitted. "But it will require you to be just indiscreet enough for the right ears to hear." And so it was that the following morning, Sergeant Burroughs let it be known, via an entirely overheard conversation at the grocer's, that in going through Faulkner's effects, they had found a second scrap of paper, matching the torn edge of the theater program, tucked into the lining of his coat. "Looks like there's writing on it," he said, with a shrug that was just a shade too casual. "Could be a name. We'll have it examined this week." By midday, the rumor had done its work. Miss Marple heard from Mrs. Weatherby, who had heard from Mrs. Platt, that Dr. Latimer had been seen walking toward the station shortly after the sergeant's remark. No ticket had been purchased, but the station master reported that the doctor had loitered on the platform for nearly 15 minutes, scanning the arrivals. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Howard to tea again. The woman came, drawn but composed, and though the conversation began with harmless talk, Miss Marple soon steered it elsewhere. "My dear," she said gently, "if you truly wish to help Dr. Latimer, you must tell me what Faulkner knew. Not what you feared he might say, what he actually knew." Mrs. Howard hesitated, twisting her gloves in her lap. "It was something from years ago. Before Latimer came here, he practiced in Brighton. There was a case, a patient who died unexpectedly. The family suspected negligence. Nothing was proved, but it was whispered about. Faulkner was a cousin to that family. I think he meant to use it, threatened to have it dragged into the light again." "And you feared a scandal?" Miss Marple said. Mrs. Howard nodded. "Latimer's work means everything to him, and he's a good man, whatever mistakes he may have made when he was younger." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Then you must see how important it is to find who killed Faulkner, if only to free Dr. Latimer from suspicion. Tell him so, from me." That evening, she took a slow walk toward the hollow, timing her arrival so that dusk had just begun to soften the edges of the fields. The air was still, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves. She did not approach the house, but waited at the stile that gave a clear view of the meadow. She was rewarded for her patience. At first, it was only a shadow moving along the hedge line. Then a figure emerged into the open. Dr. Latimer. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, and in his hand he carried something narrow. Perhaps a walking stick, perhaps an umbrella. He moved quickly, crossing the meadow without hesitation, and disappeared around the flank of the hollow. Miss Marple did not follow. She returned home by a different route, knowing Burroughs would be stationed nearby, watching. Half an hour later, he came to her door. "You were right," he said. He went inside. Didn't stay long, 5 minutes at most. When he came out, he had nothing in his hands. But I'd swear he was looking for something. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "he was looking to see if something was gone." If he feared that scrap of program really had been found, he would want to know whether Faulkner had hidden anything else there. Burroughs frowned. But why kill him over it? A man like Latimer could face down a bit of scandal. Miss Marple shook her head. "You forget. Scandal in a small place can be as deadly as any weapon. And there is another point. We do not yet know that Latimer was the one who struck Faulkner. He may have confronted him earlier or later, but the fatal moment may have belonged to someone else entirely." "And you know who," Burroughs said flatly. "I think I do," Miss Marple said. "But to prove it, we must give them the chance to make a mistake. They will, if they believe the threat has not gone away." The next day, the bait was laid more plainly. A notice appeared in the small glass-fronted board outside the station, written in Burroughs's square hand. "Items of value recovered from Chimney. Hollow now held at station for identification. Parties with rightful claim should attend." It was simple enough, but to the right person, it would read as a challenge. If there was anything left that could incriminate them, now was the time to act. It rained steadily that afternoon, the kind of soft, soaking rain that kept most people indoors. Yet from her window, Miss Marple saw a single figure crossing the green toward the station at a brisk, determined pace. It was not Latimer. It was Carroway. She rose, took her umbrella, and followed at a distance. By the time she reached the corner, Carroway was emerging from the station, his face set, his coat collar turned up against the rain. She could not see whether he carried anything, but his pace was faster now, as though wanting to put distance between himself and the place he had just left. That evening, Burroughs confirmed her suspicion. "The cupboard was opened," he said. "The tin was handled, but not taken. He must have realized it was a plant." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "Then he is nervous. Nervous men make poor liars. The time has come, I think, to have everyone in one place, and to tell the story as it truly happened. The killer will know themselves in it, and they will show it. But it must be done soon, before Carroway or anyone else decides that disappearing is safer than staying." Burroughs leaned forward. "And when you tell this story, will I hear the ending at the same time they do?" "Yes," Miss Marple said simply. "It is better that way. The truth is a delicate thing, Sergeant. Handle it too soon, and it may fall apart before it can be put to use." Outside, the rain eased, leaving the air cool and clean. The chimneys of the hollow stood dark against the fading light, their shapes as immutable as they had been for decades. But somewhere among the living in St. Anselm's, the knowledge of what had happened in its shadow was becoming too heavy to keep. One more careful push, Miss Marple thought, and the weight would shift, and the truth would tumble into view. The day Miss Marple had chosen for her gathering dawned with a peculiar brightness after the recent rain, the kind of crisp, clear air that makes colors stand out sharply. The red of the postbox on the green, the gleam of wet slate roofs, the dark green of yew hedges. It was a day that encouraged people to be out and about and to accept invitations. Sergeant Burroughs had done his part, issuing polite requests to the principal figures in the case to attend a short review of matters at the Vicarage Hall. He explained it as a way of clearing up misunderstandings before the inquest, which was due to be set. Most agreed without hesitation. A few, such as Mr. Redmayne, did so with visible reluctance, but could hardly refuse without inviting more suspicion. Miss Marple arrived early, ostensibly to assist Mrs. Weatherby in setting out chairs and ensuring the tea urn was hot, but in truth to study the arrangement of the room. She asked for the chairs to be in a loose semicircle rather than rows, with a table at the center for Burroughs's notes. This way, she could see every face at once, and more importantly, every reaction. By 3 o'clock, the company had gathered. Mr. Redmayne, pale and thin beneath his dark coat, with Simmons absent but expected to return soon. Mrs. Howard trying to maintain composure. Dr. Latimer, whose professional calm seemed just a fraction too deliberate. Mr. Carraway, restless and watchful. Mrs. Platt, who had insisted on being present as a representative of village concerns. And Burroughs himself, sturdy and stone-faced. When the murmurs had quieted, Miss Marple rose, not quickly, but with the unhurried assurance of someone who expects to be heard. "I hope," she began mildly, "that you will forgive an old woman for speaking plainly. I have lived long enough to see that people rarely tell the whole truth at once. Often, they begin with a version that hides the parts they think will hurt them. And only later, sometimes too late, do they see that in hiding those parts, they make themselves appear worse than they are." Her eyes moved from one to another, resting briefly on Mrs. Howard before sliding to Dr. Latimer. Mr. Faulkner came to St. Anselm's for a reason. That reason was tied to the Pavilion Theater in Hastings, where he saw certain people from this village, people he had met before. He carried with him part of a theater program, the other part of which was in the possession of one of those same people. She let that hang for a moment before continuing. He met Mrs. Howard there, and also spoke to Dr. Latimer. The connection between them concerned a matter from the doctor's past, one which could be used to cause trouble if someone were determined to do so. I believe Faulkner intended to use it to his advantage. Latimer's lips thinned, but he said nothing. Mrs. Howard's hands twisted in her lap. On the morning of his death, Miss Marple went on, Mrs. Howard met him at Chimney Hollow to beg him to leave. She admits as much. But she left him alive. It was after she departed that someone else arrived. Someone who had either followed her or knew of the meeting in advance. Her gaze turned to Carraway. "You were seen near the hollow the day before, with dust on your sleeve. You crossed the meadow that night, lantern in hand. And the morning Faulkner died, you had reason to think something might be hidden there. Reason enough to try your luck at the police station when you believed evidence had been found." Carraway's mouth opened, then closed again. "You can't prove—" "No," Miss Marple said calmly. "But I can explain. You had dealings with Faulkner at the coast, not in the theater, but outside it, over a card game in one of those less reputable establishments where money changes hands quickly. You owed him. When he came here, you knew he wasn't looking only for Latimer. He was looking for payment. You feared he might mention your debt to others, perhaps even to the police. A man in your position, trusted with errands, given access to property, couldn't afford such talk. Caraway flushed. I didn't kill him. I believe you didn't mean to, Miss Marple said gently. You confronted him. Perhaps he laughed at you. Perhaps he refused to give you more time. Tempers flare quickly in such moments, and a push on those narrow stairs. No! Caraway's voice was sharp, but his eyes betrayed unease. He was already... He stopped himself abruptly, realizing too late what he'd admitted, that he had seen Faulkner lying there before Burroughs arrived. A stir went through the room. Burroughs leaned forward. You'd better finish that sentence, Caraway. Caraway's shoulders sagged. I went in, yes. He was on the floor. I thought if there was anything of mine on him, I should take it back. But there wasn't. I left him and went out the meadow way. Which means, Miss Marple said softly, that you did not strike the fatal blow. But you know who did. Caraway's eyes darted to Redmayne, then away. Miss Marple followed the glance. Mr. Redmayne has kept to himself since coming here, but he has eyes and ears everywhere through Simmons. Faulkner had made inquiries about him, though Redmayne claims not to know why. In fact, Faulkner's true purpose was to reach someone else entirely. But Mr. Redmayne feared a scandal of another kind. She paused, letting the silence grow. Years ago, Mr. Redmayne's late brother was involved in certain business along the coast, business that skirted the edge of the law. Faulkner knew of it. He may have been involved himself. When he appeared at the Hollow, Redmayne believed the past was about to be exposed. Simmons, loyal to a fault, would have taken it upon himself to prevent that. Redmayne's face was unreadable, but there was a tightening around his eyes. Simmons is not here to defend himself, he said coolly. No, Miss Marple agreed, because he has gone to ground. And I think he will remain there as long as he can. But the traces are plain enough. The wedge-cut heel mark in the gravel, the scent of lavender from his preferred polish, the mortar dust brushed from the side door where his shoulder caught it. Those marks were made after Mrs. Howard left and before Caraway arrived. There was a long pause. Burroughs's voice was even when he spoke. If you're right, Miss Marple, then Simmons killed Faulkner to protect his master's reputation. Yes, Miss Marple said, but it was an unnecessary murder. Faulkner's real object here was Dr. Latimer. Simmons acted on a misunderstanding, and in doing so turned a matter of potential embarrassment into a tragedy. Mrs. Howard's breath caught. Then, Latimer is innocent? In the matter of murder, yes, Miss Marple said. But he is guilty of concealing the truth of his meeting with Faulkner, and of allowing suspicion to fall on others when a frank word might have spared them. That is something he must live with. Latimer looked away, color rising in his cheeks. Burroughs straightened. We'll send word along the coast. If Simmons is still in the country, we'll find him. Miss Marple inclined her head. You will. He is resourceful. But he will make a mistake. People always do when they have to look over their shoulder. The gathering broke up slowly, the weight of what had been revealed settling over the room. Mrs. Howard lingered to thank Miss Marple in a low voice. Caraway avoided her eye entirely. Redmayne left without a word. When the hall was nearly empty, Burroughs came to stand beside her. You've given us the shape of it, Miss Marple. But one thing. How did you know Simmons had anything to do with it? She smiled faintly. By listening, Sergeant. People tell you more than they realize when they speak about others. Simmons always answered for Mr. Redmayne, even when the question was not his to answer. That sort of loyalty can be very dangerous. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted across the green, gilding the wet grass. Miss Marple walked home at her usual, unhurried pace, her mind already turning from the grim business of murder to the more ordinary concerns of her garden. Yet as she reached her gate, she looked back toward the distant chimneys of Chimney Hollow, still standing in lonely silhouette against the sky. They would be quiet again now, but their silence would always seem a little more watchful. For in their shadow, more than one kind of secret had been kept, and one of them had cost a man his life. The inquest was set for 2 days later, but in St. Anselm's the verdict had already been rendered in the court of public opinion. The villagers had absorbed Miss Marple's account with the fascinated horror of people who were both relieved and disappointed that the murderer was not one of their closest neighbors. Though Simmons' absence was discussed in low, knowing tones, on the morning of the inquest, a bossy gray mist lay over the village, softening the edges of rooftops and muffling the sound of the church bell. Miss Marple walked to the hall where the proceedings were to be held, her step unhurried, her face calm. She had no doubt what the coroner would conclude: death by misadventure or at the hands of a person or persons unknown. But she wanted to be present. Sometimes the way people behaved after the formalities told more than the testimony itself. Inside, the air was close with damp wool and the faint tang of ink from the clerk's table. Mr. Redmayne sat apart, his pale face composed, though his fingers tapped against the arm of his chair in a rhythm that betrayed some inner strain. Mrs. Howard, in a dark hat with a modest veil, kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Dr. Latimer, beside her, looked straight ahead with the polished impassivity of a man who had practiced self-control. Carraway slouched in his seat, his eyes darting here and there like a restless bird. The coroner's questions were straightforward, the witness's answers careful. Mrs. Howard told her version of events, omitting nothing now that Miss Marple had drawn the sting. Carraway admitted finding Faulkner's body, but denied touching him. Dr. Latimer acknowledged knowing Faulkner from the Pavilion Theater, but insisted their conversation had been brief and innocuous. When it was Burroughs's turn, he laid out the known facts with deliberate simplicity, including the physical evidence, the heel mark, the mortar dust, the faint scent of lavender. It is the view of the police, he concluded, that the man known as Simmons may have been involved in the death, acting without the knowledge or instruction of his employer. The coroner's final statement was as expected: death by unlawful act, the perpetrator unknown. There was a murmur through the hall, and then the scrape of chairs as people rose. Outside, the mist had thinned, revealing the green slick with dew. Miss Marple lingered on the steps, watching the dispersal. Mrs. Howard left quickly, arm in arm with Dr. Latimer. Carraway sloped off toward the Swan. Mr. Redmayne walked alone, his tall figure cutting a solitary path toward the Dower cottage. Burroughs joined her. "That's that," he said, though his tone suggested the matter felt anything but finished. "We've sent descriptions to the ports. If Simmons tries to leave the country, we'll know." "He will not try just yet," Miss Marple said. "He will wait until he thinks interest has cooled. Then he will move, quietly, at night, by a route no one watches closely." Burroughs gave her a wry look. "And you'll be watching?" "I prefer to think of it as listening," Miss Marple said, smiling. "People always talk. It's remarkable what one can learn by seeming not to pay attention." That evening, the village began to resume its rhythms. The lamps in cottage windows glowed. The smell of suppers being prepared drifted on the damp air. But for Miss Marple, there was still one small matter unsettled. She had told the truth as far as it went, but she had not told everything she suspected. She had, for instance, not mentioned that the mother-of-pearl glove button found in the Hollow's gravel matched a pair she had once seen Simmons polishing for Mrs. Howard when he had visited her on some errand for Redmayne. It had been a fleeting visit, but Miss Marple had noticed his fastidious care with the gloves. She wondered now if Mrs. Howard had ever realized Simmons was present that morning, arriving unseen after she left Faulkner. Nor had she said aloud what she believed about Redmayne himself, that he had suspected Simmons' intent, but had done nothing to stop him, seeing in Faulkner's death a convenient end to a potential threat. It was the kind of thing one could never prove, and which would serve no purpose but to blacken a name further. 2 days after the inquest, news came from Brighton. A man matching Simmons' description had been seen boarding a bus for a small port town farther along the coast. Burrows was away when the message arrived, so Miss Marple walked it down to the station herself. She left it on his desk with a brief note and then went on to the grocer's, where Mrs. Platt was holding court. "Mark my words," Mrs. Platt was saying. "He'll never be caught. Men like that, slippery as eels. You think you've got them, and they wriggle out." Miss Marple, selecting a tin of tea, said mildly, "Eels are caught eventually, Mrs. Platt. One only needs to know where to set the trap." That night, she sat by her fire, the shadows flickering on the walls, and considered the matter closed in the only way it could be. Faulkner was dead. Simmons was gone. And the truth, at least the part that mattered to the living, was known. The rest would fade, as such things did, into the half-memory of village talk, embroidered here and there, until it bore only a passing resemblance to fact. Yet she thought often of Mrs. Howard, whose relief at Latimer's exoneration was shadowed by a kind of quiet grief, and of Latimer himself, who walked with a straighter back now, but whose gaze sometimes drifted toward the hollow, as if measuring the weight of what had happened there. Late one afternoon, she passed the meadow path and saw a single figure standing near the hedge gap, the same gap Faulkner's killer had used to come and go unseen. It was Redmayne. He stood very still, looking toward the hollow's chimneys, then turned and walked away without seeing her. Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes narrowing slightly. Some people, she thought, never truly leave the scene of a crime, whether or not their hands committed it. The following Sunday, the village returned to its more comfortable gossip. Mrs. Platt's niece's engagement, the vicar's sermon being too long, the price of butter. But beneath it all ran a quieter current, a new wariness in the way people watched each other, a reminder that even in a place as small and seemingly safe as St. Anselm's, shadows could stretch long. For her part, Miss Marple was content to let the matter rest. She knew that if Simmons were found, Burrows would send word. She also knew that it might be years before that happened, if at all. In the meantime, she would tend her garden, visit her friends, and continue her quiet watch over the village. The hollow itself would remain empty, its windows blank, its chimneys lifting against the sky. But Miss Marple knew it would not stay forgotten. Houses with histories like that never did. One day, someone would take an interest again and perhaps stir up the past in ways no one intended. And when that happened, if she were still here, she would be ready. With her needles clicking, her eyes half lowered, and her mind as sharp as ever, to see what others missed and hear what others ignored. For now, though, She let the matter slip into the village's tapestry of half-remembered tales. Somewhere out there, Simmons was moving. Careful, but not careful enough forever. And somewhere in St. Anselm's, there were those who breathed easier because Faulkner's voice was silenced. Though whether from guilt or relief, Miss Marple could not always tell. She banked her fire, set her teacup in the sink, and drew the curtains. Outside, the mist was rising again, blurring the outlines of the chimneys at Chimney Hollow until they seemed less like stone than like watchful shapes in the dark. And though the village slept, Miss Marple knew the shadows were never entirely still. The week following the inquest passed in a curious half-light of calm and unease. Outwardly, St. Anselm's appeared to have returned to its usual rhythms. The milk cart rattling down the lanes, the postman tipping his cap at garden gates, the church bell marking the hours. But beneath that ordinary surface, there was a tension that did not dissolve, as though the village itself were holding on to some unfinished sentence. Miss Marple noticed it most in the glances people exchanged when the Hollow's name was mentioned. Even the children, who normally dared each other to venture up the lane to its overgrown gates, seemed to avoid the place. The older villagers, those who remembered the last time the Hollow's chimneys had featured in dark talk, carried themselves with a particular restraint, as if aware that something had been left unsettled. One afternoon, as she trimmed the faded blooms from her late roses, Miss Marple received a visit from Sergeant Burroughs. He looked more tired than usual, his coat damp from the sea mist that had blown in from the coast. "We've had a wire from Portsmouth," he said without preamble. Simmons was seen boarding a freighter bound for Lisbon. The description matches too well to be chance. "Then he's gone," Miss Marple said quietly. Burroughs nodded. "Gone, unlikely beyond our reach. Unless something changes, that's the end of it. But," he hesitated, frowning, "there's a part of me that can't quite leave it alone. Not while certain people here still seem relieved rather than shocked." Miss Marple met his gaze. "I expect you mean Mr. Redmayne," Burroughs grunted. "If Simmons acted to protect him, he's not shown much grief about it. But there's nothing I can hang on him. No proof he knew what Simmons intended." "There are many kinds of guilt, Sergeant," Miss Marple said. "Some are legal. Others are simply the burden one carries in private." After he left, she sat for a long time by her window, her tea cooling on the table. She had never doubted Simmons' hand in the killing, but she could not quite shake the image of Mr. Redmayne standing in the meadow that day, gazing toward the hollow. Some things were not done with, even when the law declared them finished. 2 days later, Mrs. Weatherby called, full of the sort of errand that might have seemed trivial in any other season. "Jane, we're forming a small committee to see about restoring the Hollow's garden. Just the outer part, you understand, not the house. The idea is to make it less of an eyesore. Mr. Redmayne has agreed, surprisingly enough." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "Has he indeed?" "Oh, yes. He says it will discourage idle curiosity." "I dare say he's right, though I should have thought a locked gate and a few brambles did that already." The committee's first inspection of the grounds was set for the following morning. Miss Marple decided to attend, ostensibly to give her opinion on the choice of climbing roses, but in truth, because she suspected there might still be things worth noticing before the Hollow began its slow transformation. The day dawned bright, with a pale autumn sun warming the damp grass. A small group assembled at the lane's end. Mrs. Weatherby with a notebook, Mr. Redmayne in a well-cut coat, Caraway brought along to advise on practical repairs, and 2 of the Mothers' Union for good measure. The gate was stiff, but Caraway forced it open. The garden beyond was a tangle of long grass and nettles, but here and there the bones of its former design could be seen. A mossy path curving toward the side of the house, a collapsed trellis, the stumps of long-dead shrubs. Miss Marple let the others move ahead while she paused near the gooseberry bush where the glove had been found weeks before. The ground here was damp, and a faint impression caught her eye. A single footprint, the edge of the heel marked with a crescent chip. Old, but not from the original day. The rain patterns told her it had been made more recently. She straightened slowly, her gaze drifting toward Mr. Redmayne. He was standing near the side door, speaking low to Caraway, but his eyes kept flicking toward the bush, as if checking that nothing remained there. Inside the hollow, they ventured only into the lower rooms. The air was cold and stale, and the faded wallpaper hung in loose folds. Mrs. Weatherby made notes about possible community use, though her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple said little, but her eyes missed nothing. The scuffed rail at the bottom of the stairs, the faint mark on the wall where Faulkner's head had struck, the long settled dust disturbed in a narrow line toward the side door. When they emerged again into the sunlight, she noticed something else. Something small but telling. Mr. Redmayne's coat cuff bore a pale smear, as though it had brushed against crumbling mortar. The committee dispersed soon after, Mrs. Weatherby promising to circulate ideas. Miss Marple walked back to the village with Caraway, speaking of generalities until they reached the green. Then she said, almost idly, "You've been busy in the hollow since the committee formed, haven't you?" Caraway looked startled. No more than anyone else. Miss Marple said. "But someone has been there at night. Fresh footprints by the gooseberry bush. Old habits, perhaps?" His mouth tightened. "I've no reason to go there at night." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "unless someone asked you to." She left it at that, letting the words settle. That evening, as she was banking her fire, a knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Howard. She looked pale, but her eyes were steady. "I thought you should know," Mrs. Howard said, "that Mr. Redmayne came to see me today. He asked whether I still had the gloves I wore that morning. Said it was important to set certain matters straight." "And do you?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Howard hesitated. "I burned them after you found the button. I was frightened it might look worse than it was." Miss Marple nodded. "That was wise, under the circumstances. But it tells me Mr. Redmayne is still concerned about what may or may not be found." That night, she considered what remained of the puzzle. Simmons had struck the blow, yes. But the pattern of movements around the hollow since his flight suggested that someone was making certain no trace of him or of his purpose lingered. That someone had influence over both Caraway and Mrs. Howard, and a personal interest in silencing questions. The following morning, she called on Burroughs. "Sergeant," she said, "you may not catch Simmons in the near term, but you might yet coax another confession. Not about the act, but about what led to it. And if you do, you may find your understanding of this case shifts in a rather important way." Burroughs frowned. "You think Redmayne knew what Simmons was going to do?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that he suspected it and did nothing to stop it. There is no charge for that in our law, but there is a moral reckoning, and sometimes that is more difficult to face." In the days that followed, the hollow's gates remained shut, but the village's attention began, at last, to drift toward other matters. The harvest festival at the church was approaching. Mrs. Weatherby was consumed with table arrangements. Mrs. Platt had acquired a new nephew to boast of. Yet for all that, Miss Marple felt the undercurrent still. One afternoon, walking past the green, she saw Redmayne standing alone by the lane to the hollow, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked up as she passed, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if each understood that the other knew precisely how much had been left unsaid. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought as she walked on, that was the true end of the matter. Not an arrest, not a tidy confession, but a shared knowledge that would never quite fade. Some truths did not belong to courts or coroners. They lingered instead in the spaces between people, shaping their choices in ways they might never admit. The hollow's chimneys stood black against the lowering sky as she turned the corner toward her cottage. She doubted she would ever see Simmons again. But if by chance he did return, she would know. The village would change in an instant, the air would thicken, and the shadows lengthen. Until then, she would keep her quiet watch, the way she always had. Through the seasons, through the comings and goings, through the small dramas and the rare, deadly ones. For that was the nature of places like St. Anselm's. Beneath the lacework of politeness and routine lay a web of connections and grudges and loyalties, fine as spider silk and just as capable of snaring the unwary. And Miss Marple, from her seat by the window with her knitting in her lap, knew every thread. The final days of October brought a restless wind that rattled the bare branches and sent the last of the golden leaves chasing along the lanes. St. Anselm's was preparing for the All Hallows service at the church, an event that always stirred old superstitions and made people speak in half-whispers after dark. For most, it was harmless tradition. But for those whose consciences were troubled, the season's shadows seemed to creep closer. Miss Marple, whose conscience was clear, but whose mind was as alert as ever, had been noticing the small ways in which certain villagers altered their habits since the inquest. Mrs. Howard no longer lingered in the high street, preferring to keep to the quieter back lanes. Dr. Latimer's visits to patients were brisker, his cheerfulness more deliberate. And Mr. Redmayne, though still seldom seen, was observed twice walking the meadow path toward the hollow, as if checking that its silence remained undisturbed. The hollow itself had settled back into decay, its windows blank, its side door fastened with a new iron hasp. Yet Miss Marple had learned long ago that it was never the place itself that was dangerous, but the thoughts people carried to it. She was thinking exactly that when Sergeant Burroughs came calling on a blustery afternoon. He was in plain clothes, his expression thoughtful. "We've had a letter," he said, producing a single folded sheet. "Posted from Santander. No signature, but it's in Simmons' hand. Says he's working his passage on a fishing boat, heading south. And then, this line: 'Tell the master it's done, and no one's the wiser.'" Miss Marple read the words, then set the letter down. "And you think by master he means Mr. Redmayne?" Burroughs shrugged. "Could be. But even if we could prove it, the law's no good for this sort of thing. It's a statement without specifics. Redmayne could say Simmons was talking about a perfectly innocent errand." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "He could. But what interests me is that Simmons felt the need to write at all. That suggests he's not certain the matter is entirely settled." Burroughs frowned. "You think he's worried?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that in leaving so abruptly, he may have left something unfinished or overlooked something he meant to remove." That evening, she walked to the hollow at dusk. The wind had dropped, and the air was still, carrying the faint smell of damp leaves. She did not go inside. She had no need. Her eyes traveled over the garden, the gooseberry bush, the worn path to the side door. Then she saw it, a faint glimmer in the grass where the nettles thinned. Kneeling carefully, she uncovered a small object half buried in the damp earth. A flat silver case, the kind used for cigarettes. It was dented at one corner and bore the initials J.R. inside the lid. The case was empty, but its presence here was a puzzle. If it belonged to Redmayne, why had it been left? If to Faulkner, why had Simmons not taken it with him? Miss Marple wiped it clean, wrapped it in her handkerchief, and took it home. By lamplight, she examined it more closely. There was a thin, almost invisible smear along the hinge, dried wax, pale and brittle. Not candle wax, but the sort used for sealing envelopes or packages. It had been pressed against something that left no impression she could see. The next morning, she carried the case to Burroughs. He turned it over in his hands. J.R. could be Redmayne, could be someone else entirely. Or, Miss Marple said, it could have been planted. Burroughs looked up sharply. Planted? To make us think of Redmayne, Miss Marple said. If Simmons wished to protect him, he wouldn't leave something so plainly marked. But if Simmons wished to throw suspicion his way, perhaps to keep him from turning against him later, this would do very well. Burroughs whistled softly. You think Simmons is clever enough for that? I think he is clever enough to survive, Miss Marple said. And survival often depends on making sure others are too busy defending themselves to pursue you. 2 days later, the mystery deepened. Mrs. Weatherby called in a state of quiet agitation. Jane, you'll never believe it. Mr. Redmayne's leaving. Says he's had enough of village gossip and is going abroad for his health. Simmons may be with him, he says, though I thought Simmons had run off for good. Miss Marple listened without surprise. And when does he leave? Tomorrow, early train. That night, she sat by her fire, the silver case on the table beside her. She thought of Redmayne, of Simmons' letter, of the calculated half-truths that had swirled around Faulkner's death. She did not believe Redmayne had wielded the fatal blow, but she believed he knew precisely why it had been struck, and that his departure now was a way of drawing a line under the whole matter. In the morning, she walked to the station under a sky streaked with pale clouds. A small knot of villagers had gathered to see Redmayne off, though their farewells were polite rather than warm. He stood on the platform, immaculate as ever, his luggage neatly stacked, his eyes cool. When he saw Miss Marple, he inclined his head. Miss Marple, he said, I trust you will keep an eye on my property while I'm away. I expect it will take care of itself, she replied. The train pulled in with a hiss of steam. Redmayne boarded without a backward glance, and within minutes the carriage windows showed only the blur of the countryside beyond. The villagers drifted away, their attention already turning to the day's errands. Burroughs appeared at her side. And that's that, I suppose. For now, Miss Marple said, but he will not be the last to come and go from the Hollow with secrets. Places like that draw them, the way certain flowers draw bees. The following week, life in St. Anselm's slipped further back into its familiar pattern. The Hollow remained locked, the meadow path empty, the gooseberry bush bare of any further surprises. But Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Howard walked with a lighter step, that Dr. Latimer no longer glanced over his shoulder when crossing the green, and that Caraway had taken to spending more time at the Swan, as if eager to be in plain sight. And yet, on a cold, clear evening, as she drew her curtains, She saw a lone figure standing by the stile that overlooked the hollow. The stance was unfamiliar, the coat too long for any local man she knew. He stood for a while, motionless, then turned and disappeared into the mist. She smiled to herself. "Another thread in the web," she murmured. "It will be tugged in its own time." In her heart, she knew the story of the footsteps at Chimney Hollow was not truly finished. It had simply entered a quieter phase, waiting for some future hand to disturb it again. And when that happened, whether in months or years, she would be ready, as always, to notice the thing no one else saw, and to follow the smallest sound until it led to the truth. For now, though, she set the silver case in the drawer where she kept other small relics of past puzzles. Some, like this one, would never be claimed. Others had long since been explained and forgotten, but each, in its way, was a reminder of the strange, tangled patterns human lives could weave. Patterns as intricate and as enduring as the spider's web glistening in the morning dew outside her window. The first frosts came early that November, whitening the cottage roofs and turning the fields to silver under the morning sun. The sharp air carried the scent of wood smoke from a dozen hearths, and the lanes grew quieter as the season pressed its way toward winter. For most of St. Anselm's, the excitement, if it could be called that, of the Hollow affair was already fading into a memory, softened and reshaped with each retelling. But Miss Marple knew better than to imagine such things truly ended. A murder, even one where the principal actor had fled beyond reach, left ripples that spread in unseen ways. She noticed them still, in the polite but careful greetings exchanged between certain neighbors, in the way the vicar's sermon lingered more than usual on the themes of repentance and the keeping of one's word. The hollow itself was locked and barred now, the meadow path grown over with frost-browned grass. Yet even in its silence, it seemed to hold an odd sort of watchfulness, as if the very bricks remembered what had passed within their walls. And perhaps they did, Miss Marple thought one morning as she walked to the post office, for buildings often absorbed the tempers of those who lived in them. She had not expected to hear more of Simmons or Mr. Redmayne, and in that expectation, she was correct. No word came from abroad. The letter from Santander remained the last trace, and Burroughs had quietly resigned himself to leaving the matter where it lay. Mrs. Howard was seen more often at the vicarage, lending her skills to parish events. Dr. Latimer's practice steadied. His manner with patients was warmer, perhaps from relief, perhaps from some private recognition of how near he had come to losing all. One evening, Burroughs stopped by on his way home. "Thought you'd like to know," he said, warming his hands at her fire. "The Hollow's garden project is being postponed till spring. Weatherby says it's not the season for it." "That's wise," Miss Marple replied. "Things grow better when they're planted at the proper time." He gave her a shrewd look. "You mean more than roses, don't you?" She smiled faintly. "I nearly always do." They sat for a moment in companionable quiet, the fire crackling softly. At last, Burroughs said, "I've been thinking. It's strange how many people were willing to keep back a part of the truth, not just the guilty ones." "That is human nature, Sergeant," Miss Marple said. "We shade the truth to protect ourselves, or those we care for, or simply to avoid unpleasantness. But the truth itself is patient. It waits until someone notices a loose thread and gives it a gentle tug." When he had gone, she returned to her, knitting, her mind replaying the case in its entirety. She thought of Alice Pettiford's frightened face on that first day, of the lantern's glow in the dark, of the mother-of-pearl button, the lavender scent, the scuffed stair rail. None of those details, alone, would have been enough. But together, they had told a story that no one wished to tell outright. It was 2 weeks later, with the frost now a regular companion to the mornings, that Miss Marple had her last encounter connected to the hollow. She was returning from the grocer's when she saw Carraway leaning against the wall outside the Swan. He straightened when he saw her, touching his cap in a gesture that was almost respectful. "I wanted to say," he began awkwardly, "that I'm sorry for not being straight with you before." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "You told me enough when it mattered, and you've learned, I hope, that secrets are poor company." He gave a short, rueful laugh. "I have. You've a way of making a man see sense, Miss Marple." She inclined her head. "It is not me, Mr. Carraway. It is the truth. It is always there, waiting for us to admit it." They parted, and she thought no more of it. Whatever his part had been, it was over now. The rest of his life would be shaped by the choices he made from here. December arrived with short days and long nights. Preparations for Christmas began in earnest. Wreaths on doors, puddings being steamed in cottage kitchens, the vicarage alive with carol rehearsals. In this bustle, the hollow receded even further from conversation. The villagers preferred to speak of the coming festivities, the chance of snow, the latest letter from a son or daughter away in the city. And so it was that, on a bright, cold morning, with the green rimed in frost and the church bell tolling for the Advent service, Miss Marple felt the story had reached its natural conclusion. The hollow would stand empty through the winter, its chimneys watching over the fields, and in time, the whispers about footsteps in the gravel and a stranger's death would become just another thread in the tapestry of village lore. But Miss Marple knew that somewhere, perhaps in Lisbon, perhaps farther still, Simmons carried the knowledge of what he had done. She knew, too, that Mr. Redmayne, wherever he had gone, carried the quieter guilt of what he had allowed to happen. And she knew, because experience had taught her, that both would live differently for it, whether they admitted it or not. As for herself, she was content to return to her roses, her knitting, and the steady, watchful life of the village. She had, after all, always understood that peace was not the absence of wrongdoing, but the knowledge of how to put things right when they went wrong. And in this case, as far as it could be put right, it had been. She closed her garden gate, the sound crisp in the frosty air, and turned toward her cottage. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the green, but the windows ahead glowed warm with lamplight. Somewhere behind her, far off toward the edge of the village, the hollow stood as it had for decades, silent, patient, and waiting for the next story to find it. The snow came early that year, laying a clean white quilt over the rooftops and muffling the lanes so that every step sounded close and deliberate. St. Anselm's looked as though it had been pressed into a Christmas card, chimneys breathing out faint curls of smoke, frost-gilded hedges sparkling in the weak sunlight. It was a scene to soothe any restless mind. But Miss Marple's mind, though at rest, was never still. She had thought the matter of the hollow was closed, or as closed as such things ever are. Simmons was gone, Redmayne abroad, Mrs. Howard and Dr. Latimer restored to a sort of uneasy normality. But a letter arrived on the first Monday of December that tied the remaining threads into a final, undeniable knot. It was postmarked Lisbon, written in a hand as precise as clockwork. "Miss Marple," it began without salutation, "I know you understand why I did what I did. My loyalty to the master was all I had, and I would do the same again. But I want you to know, he knew. Not in detail, perhaps, but enough. When I returned from the coast and told him the man from Hastings meant trouble, he said only, See to it. And so I did. Tell the master it is done. He will know what I mean. It was signed, in a neat flourish, Simmons. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it carefully into its envelope. She sat for some minutes, listening to the faint tick of the mantel clock, thinking of the calm, pale face of Mr. Redmayne as he had left the village. He had not lied, not in so many words. But he had allowed the most convenient outcome to stand. And that, she knew, was a form of guilt the law did not punish, but life rarely forgave. That afternoon, she walked the snowy lane to the police station and placed the letter on Sergeant Burroughs' desk. He read it in silence, his mouth tightening, then pushed it back toward her. "It's not evidence," he said. "Not the sort a court would take." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But it's the truth, which is something rather different. And sometimes, Sergeant, that is the better thing to have." He looked at her a long moment, then nodded. "You'll keep it, then?" "Yes, I'll keep it." In the days leading up to Christmas, the village's attention turned wholly to the festivities. The carol service, the exchange of small gifts, the vicarage's annual gathering. The hollow, snowbound and silent, stood apart from it all, its chimneys rising like watchtowers above the frost-hardened meadow. On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple walked past it one last time. The garden lay under drifts, the gooseberry bush only a pale tangle, the side door closed tight. She paused at the stile and let her gaze rest on the house. There was no malice in its silence now, only the knowledge that it had witnessed something human, flawed and irrevocable. She thought of Alice Pettiford's frightened story of footsteps in the gravel, of Mrs. Howard's trembling hands, of Carraway's shame, of Latimer's near ruin, of Redmayne's steady eyes that had revealed nothing, and of Simmons, loyal, dangerous Simmons, now somewhere far away on a foreign street. Every one of them had been shaped, in some way, by those few days in the hollow. When she turned back toward the village, the church bell was ringing for the evening service, its sound carrying warmly over the snow. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People would go on telling the story of the footsteps at Chimney Hollow for years, embroidering it, forgetting parts, adding others. But she would always remember it as it truly was. Not just a puzzle solved, but a reminder of how the smallest choices, a walk down a certain lane, a word left unsaid, could tip the balance between life and death. At her gate, she looked once over her shoulder toward the distant chimneys, already dim in the falling dusk. Then she went inside, drew the curtains, and set her kettle to boil. Outside, the snow went on falling, gentle and inexorable, erasing the tracks in the lane until all was smooth again.